The Trump-Pence regime must go now. The decision this past week by the Democratic Party leadership to pursue impeachment tremendously sharpens the fight over the Trump-Pence regime's forging of a thoroughly fascist America. This escalation of the fight at the pinnacles of political power holds profound consequence for the future. This opens up the possibility for increased mass struggle by the masses of people taking to the streets and the public squares, and at the same time, it requires such struggle if there is to be a positive outcome to the even more tumultuous time we have now entered. And I will return to discussing this move to impeach in more depth shortly. Less than a week ago, Refuse Fascism announced that we had determined that the political situation had developed to the point where we needed to call for sustained, mass, nonviolent protests beginning in late October. Over this summer, where mass murders against immigrants in California and then El Paso, following mass murders of Jewish people on top of the revelation that the Trump-Pence regime was still separating refugee and asylum-seeking children from their parents in defiance of a court order, shocked the consciences of millions. People who had refrained from struggle and relied on the Democratic Party were becoming disillusioned as the Democrats funded border security, collaborating with the Trump-Pence regime, and facilitating a highway to hell. Then came the electrifying images of Puerto Rico, where millions took to the streets day after day and drove out their governor. And now Hong Kong, where weekly protests of millions braving and thwarting repression won at first their demands, and now their struggle continues as the people become more emboldened to go to even new demands and to all 5 of their original demands. And all of this led us to call for these meetings, to say that it is on us to set in motion and to lead the kind of mass-sustained, non-violent protest that does not stop until this fascist Trump-Pence regime is removed from power through our unleashing and leading a different power, the power of the people. If it was pressing on us last weekend to call for launching this different kind of protest beginning in October, it has become all the more necessary and possible now that the impeachment hearings have begun. We have important discussion and work to do today. It's on each and on all of us to struggle to bring forward the potential power of a people who will stand up and be unrelenting in their demand. Our proposal is this. On October 19th, in New York City and here in Los Angeles, we will call protests that will essentially announce to the world that a movement of sustained nonviolent protest has begun. These first actions should involve as many people as we can mobilize in the short time that we have between now and the 19th, while their defining character will be to become a bold declaration, a call out to the people to start amassing in cities and towns across the country on the next Saturday, October 26th, and then to do so for 4 consecutive Saturdays through November 16th. Every week should dramatize the need for this to grow and to broaden. Okay, just to diverge for a second. That means here in Los Angeles and New York, it's 5 consecutive Saturdays, okay? But we're calling on the whole country to really get out in their masses for 4 consecutive Saturdays, beginning on the 26th of October and then continuing through the 16th of November. And hopefully we'll then be in a different position and we'll figure out a nice and a good and a compelling plan for Thanksgiving weekend. The protests and days in between these Saturday protests should challenge and involve more and more people, growing so that thousands grow quickly, hopefully within a few weeks to tens of thousands, and we should not rule out but be oriented toward bringing forward hundreds of thousands and then ultimately millions. This must become a movement that has the potential to win and by amassing significant numbers of people in the streets, and by the momentum it gathers, including by potentially going to daily protests, continuing these daily protests and nonviolent mass protests, and by our determination to not stop until our unifying demand, the Trump-Pence regime must go, is met. These three things, numbers of people, momentum, and resolve around a single demand, can create a political crisis for the rulers of this country that reverberates around the world. A crisis of such scale that it cannot be ignored or repressed without further unraveling the image and the legitimacy of the whole power structure, as the government fears losing the allegiance of an even more massive section of the people, and as these images go around the world, the image of their invincibility is shaken. As we have seen in other countries, a situation like this, brought about by the sustained protests of masses of people, could compel a significant section of those in power to finally act to remove the Trump-Pence regime. And that, combined with an even more intensified effort from us, the people, could actually win. Some whose vision is constrained by what is today will say that it's inconceivable that the fascist Republican-controlled Senate would convict Trump of impeachment. No, we must drive out the regime, no matter what it takes. With the kind of massive sustained protests we are proposing today, many things that are inconceivable now can become possible. The decision by the Democratic Party leadership to impeach now, after 3 years of refusing to do so, is both a reflection of and heightens the contention at the top of the ruling class. As this process is just beginning, today I can only offer some initial thoughts, and I ask all of you to contribute yours over the next weeks as this impeachment process unfolds. You can write us at refusefascism.org. There are many forces in motion with different programs and agendas among those with the real power in Congress, the courts, the military, and those captains of finance and industry who they serve. Yet in broad strokes, there is a basic fight between a section of those in power who are committed to shattering the rules of the game, concentrated in the Republican Party of Trump and Pence, who are fighting to bring a fascist America. Arrayed against this is the ruling class consensus that has prevailed since World War II, that's now principally grouped around the Democratic Party, as well as those who were what the media called mainstream Republicans, but who were reactionaries in their own right. Impeachment has now sharpened the struggle between these two forces, even as there are many different actors within each of these forces. But look, the Trump and Pence and their whole regime will not give up. Their hardcore base is gearing up for battle, with Fox News and a whole array of white supremacist fascist media getting ready for a serious fight. The regime has their people in the courts, and even if the courts should rule against them, they may well defy the courts. And both to stay in office, and then if Trump is able to withstand impeachment, or other moves that they make to remove him, or even should we not succeed in removing him before the election, if he wins, or if he steals the election, or if he refuses to leave in office, if he loses in 2020, there is a real and serious risk that he could make and take a further huge leap toward all-out fascism, either to stay in power or to solidify power if he prevails, and he will do this with no small amount of revenge. The Democrats, for their part, want to limit the impeachment inquiry into Trump's actions endangering national security and his self-serving corruption in his attempt to win the 2020 election, without touching on the far deeper crimes of his fascist agenda, from the concentration camps to the border to dangerously accelerating the devastation of the environment. I just want to repeat this. The Democrats want to limit the impeachment inquiry into Trump's actions to endangering national security and to self-serving corruption on his part as part of his plan to win the 2020 election, without touching on the far deeper crimes of his fascist agenda, such as the concentration camps on the border and his dangerous acceleration of the devastation of the environment. This is important. The Democratic Party will not even mention the word fascism. The top Democrats want to remove Trump without going after the whole regime and without calling out the fascism that is at its core. And this would leave the cancer in place to grow even more dangerously. There is ample evidence, countless examples of the shattering of the rule of law, precedents, and real and urgent crimes against humanity, as well as the unleashing of the virulent, murderous white supremacy and misogyny that this regime has perpetrated. And there is no lack of evidence to impeach on these grounds the Democratic Party, who are themselves targets of this regime. And this whole incident in the Ukraine is an example of that, a stellar example of that, going after the top representative. They are nonetheless more beholden to and are representatives of the system that has given rise to Donald Trump than they are to humanity here and around the world. But, as the revolutionary leader Bob Avakian has pointed out, one, they are afraid of Trump and what he might unleash against them. Two, they are afraid of what his rabid base might do. And three, quote, they are afraid of the people on the other side of the divide, us in short. The people who tend to vote for the Democrats, especially the basic masses of oppressed people. They are afraid of the people who are angry about what's represented by Trump and Pence. They don't want those people out in the street unless it is contained within the narrow confines of what the Democratic Party and the system it serves can allow. And they don't want the confrontation between those people and the fascists who have rallied behind Trump. The Democratic Party leadership will not mobilize you to act to stop this regime, except to corral you to domesticate your righteous outrage into the elections and to voting in 2020. And as for impeachment, the most they will tolerate is mass support from below within the parameters of how they want to prosecute this impeachment. If we allow this to be focused solely on national security and corruption, this will narrow people's sights and the fight to stop fascism. It will leave Pence and the whole regime and the fascist movement intact, and that will surely not be favorable for the interests of humanity. The most important thing for us to grab hold of regarding impeachment is that there must not be only two forces in the field. There needs to be a third force, the people struggling for what is in the interests of humanity. Our battle, in fact, must not be confined to impeachment, even as today we should recognize that this is our moment to launch the struggle to drive out this fascist regime for the full array of crimes they have committed and far worse that they are aiming for. If we do this, we can win this battle and open up space for everyone who cares about saving the planet and humanity and in bringing about a just world. As a revolutionary and an advocate of the new communism developed by Bob Avakian and an organizer for an actual revolution to emancipate humanity, we are boldly putting forth for people to check out this new communism and our movement for revolution, and are putting forth what really could be a liberating third future, other than the two represented by the Republicans and the Democrats. But for this movement for mass sustained protests involving hundreds of thousands and eventually millions to demand the removal of this regime, it will only succeed if it involves, if it inspires, and it unleashes people who believe that this system and America could be a force for good in the world, as well as those who have different views of more fundamental change. What we are calling for has been done all over the world, from the Arab Spring to Puerto Rico to Hong Kong, and we can learn from those struggles. If and when this struggle catches hold and grows, then the impeachment process can play a role. But if we sit passively, waiting for impeachment to solve the problem, we may well end up in an even worse spot than we are in today. We are calling for a different kind of nonviolent sustained protest, which uncorks the now suppressed feelings of millions against the regime, tapping into the outrage that this vile, bullying, white supremacist, misogynist, anti-immigrant, war-mongering, anti-LGBTQ fascist regime that is hell-bent on letting the planet burn. The demand, the Trump-Pence regime must go now, is simple, direct, and it invites the broadest unity. It expresses the actual interests of the people of the world, and it concentrates the deeply felt desires of millions of people of diverse backgrounds and beliefs living in this country who are living in dread and in anger at what the Trump-Pence regime is doing. Yes, right now most people are going along with great crimes, such that it often feels like we are walking through the night of the living dead. But we are here today to wake people the fuck up. And to do so by taking the responsibility to struggle with everything we've got to move masses of people out of their stupor and into the streets. There are millions who feel, as the Refuse Fascism slogan captures it, in the name of humanity, we refuse to live in a fascist America. We need to shake people from avoiding what's happening, living with their heads buried in the mirror of their iPhones as the world careens into the horror of fascism. Look at the students around the world over the last week who are striking to save the planet. Look at the faces from Puerto Rico and Hong Kong, and you see something different. Joyous, determined people, inspired to act with conscience. When we do this, then dread can give way to hope. The fruitless fretting over my life can transform into exhilaration and a sense of purpose that comes when we stand up with others who are fighting for the future. The we must grow as we sharply struggle with one another and everyone about what we face and what we need to do, making the case to stop being complicit and to join in what is surely one of the great challenges of recent history to drive this fascist regime from power. This can be done. And as I said, such struggle has been and is currently being waged around the world, where people took matters into their own hands. They refused to wait for more promises to be betrayed, with no patience for stacked courts and talk shop, do-nothing legislatures, where they felt that to wait for elections that are too far off and are rigged was intolerable. And while the struggle in this country will not be exactly the same, it is a more complex place. There is the simple. Get in the streets and stay. There is inspiration as well as rich positive and negative lessons to learn and heed from these other experiences. We face a fascist regime. They are bringing fascism. Those who say it can't happen here are wrong. It is happening. It is already happening. Yes, you're right. Those who say, well, it's sort of fascism, but then find a reason to say that it is not yet fascism, are making excuses and finding reason to back away from, to not do what needs to be done. So we need to get into this. We need to understand what fascism is, to make the case, because people act on what they understand to be necessary. We face an extraordinary situation, a regime and a Republican Party that is fascist and hell-bent on consolidating a qualitatively more draconian form of rule over this country with grave impact on the whole world. Indeed, the survival of humanity hangs in the balance as this regime denies science, ridicules climate change, and has torn up every environmental protection they can. The outpouring of students around this past week around the world was a beautiful thing and a harbinger of what could be. They see the stakes for their future. They are organizing and getting to work because they recognize the existential crisis for humanity. These students have shown a determination to do what? To face facts and to get others to do so, and their spirit and their desire to fight for a scientific approach needs to also be brought into the battle to drive out the Trump-Pence regime. This regime is not only on overdrive to accelerate global warming, but when faced with hundreds of thousands of migrants fleeing countries devastated in part by climate change today, a number that will grow to be millions and hundreds of millions of people worldwide, it meets them with walls, concentration camps, and worse, while it doubles down on accelerating climate change. Saving the planet is not the only question that threatens humanity. We are balanced on the hair trigger of whether or not the Trump-Pence regime will unleash a war with Iran. Do not underestimate the conflagration that could ensue from such a move. And Trump has said, if we have nuclear weapons, why can't we use them? And a year ago, this October, Mike Pence gave a speech threatening China that extolled Trump's beefing up of the most powerful military in history and highlighting Trump's modernizing of the new U.S. nuclear arsenal. Pence ended his speech invoking a Chinese proverb that heaven sees the future. He did this in a way that was straight up gangsta, delivered deadpan with menace, asserting America's right to dominate and threaten the world while cloaked in the garb of fulfilling a mission from God. The Refuse Fascism call to act sharply puts it that, quote, "Make America Great Again is a 21st century program of manifest destiny, America first, wrapped in the flag and Mike Pence's Bible taken literally, with a program of white supremacy, misogyny, and xenophobia." And xenophobia is the hatred of foreign people. This underscores once again the import of Refuse Fascism's second slogan, which is, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. And Bob Avakian has said that American lives are not more important than other people's lives. When it is U.S. bombs and satellites guiding the death and devastation of the country of Yemen by Saudi Arabia, resulting in mass starvation and an epidemic of cholera, and you avert your eyes, you blind yourself, and you become complicit. Powerful forces in the ruling class of this country got behind Trump and Pence because they determined that the ruling norms and social compacts since World War II were no longer tenable for the future of America domestically and for its domination of the world. They see that the only way to cohere the country is as a white, fundamentalist, Christian, patriarchal society. That the liberalization since the 1960s would destroy that reactionary cohesion, and they believe that the international alliances that has maintained their system since World War II were undermining the U.S. position as the top dog in the world. That their current and that explains and what's behind their current shredding of agreements and treaties. There is a very important talk by Bob Avakian, The Trump-Pence Regime Must Go, where he argues that the belief in America, that America is a force for good in the world, that we are the good guys, and that this mindset is one of the main things that demobilizes people from standing up against this regime and the system as a whole. This is important for people to think about and reflect on and to watch the film. There exists a whole web of global economic relations that feeds the American way of life. The ability to consume, consume, consume. The clothes we wear, the food we eat, the precious metal in our cell phones. All these are the end result of a ruthless global economic and political system of brutal exploitation of people, of millions of children around the world, and all of this is enforced at the point of a gun by the 600 military bases that the U.S. maintains around the world. And this belief that anything the U.S. does is justified because we are the good guys, and the lifestyle that undergirds this myth is a major source of the political passivity and, frankly, complicity with great crimes. Many in Refuse Fascism, and probably most of the people who need to flood into the movement to drive out the regime, will not share this systemic critique of capitalism, imperialism, and the role of the U.S. in the world that I am making right now, but will hold views that America is or could be a force for good in the world, even as we all recognize and unite that the Trump-Pence fascist America is a danger to humanity. The kind of unity and the tremendous spirit of cooperation that this struggle required should unleash an atmosphere of critical thinking, dialogue, and debate over not only strategy and tactics for the moment and for the movement, but over everything, including over the struggle between and the difference between reform and revolution. But look, let's get down on the ground on something here. Some have raised that the participation of communists could cause some to hesitate to be a part of this. And in answer to this here, I can only say a few things briefly. First, I would refer you to the poem that was read earlier by Pastor Niemöller. First, they came for the communists, and I did nothing because I wasn't a communist. And then they came for the trade unionists, and I did nothing because I wasn't a trade unionist. And then they came for the Jews, because I wasn't Jew, so I did nothing. And then they came for the Catholics. And the point of the poem is that when they finally came for me, there was no one left to stand up. But there's also a more general point that distancing that goes on all too often between good and bad protesters has only benefited the powers that be, enabling them to divide and repress. Even as we are determined in Refuse Fascism that the protests we are calling for will be nonviolent on the part of those protesting. And this goes for the revolutionaries as well. We are determined that these protests are what we say they need to be. And accusations to the contrary are just that, slander. To the new generations who are in the streets to save the planet, who are saying, and you could hear them in their thousands saying the other day, that it's the system that's the problem, don't they need to be part of robust debates over the varying views of reform and revolution? Would this be excluded from their purview? And for my part, and for others who follow the new communism of Bob Avakian, we invite you to check it out. It is worth noting that along with his breakthrough in resynthesizing communism as a method approach and as a goal, he has been working on and warning of the development of this fascist movement in the U.S. for decades. He identified the fascist direction of this regime right upon the election of Trump-Pence in 2016, and this led to a diverse group of people to form the broad-based Refuse Fascism before the inauguration. And we think that his speech, which is now a film, The Trump-Pence Regime Must Go, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America, a better world is possible, is invaluable in understanding and uniting people broadly to drive out this regime. And I recommend that you watch it online at refusefascism.org. And if you're in a city where it's being shown in a theater, go see it there. The fascism of the Trump-Pence regime is not just America first in relation to the rest of the world, but its programmatic core is a triad of white supremacy, misogyny, and xenophobia, which spews from the Twitter finger and the loud mouth of Mein Trumpf. Calling the KKK and Nazis very fine people, Trump is a fascist pig who brags of grabbing women by their genitals, slandering refugees and asylum seekers from countries devastated by the U.S. as rapists and murderers, vicious lies that incited mass murder in El Paso, California, and and Pittsburgh, shattering political norms and throwing away the dog whistle of racism. He glories and gloats in rallies, throwing out racist tropes like telling the squad of congresswomen of color to go back where they came from, thrilling the rabid racist mob that is his base who shriek back at him, "Throw them out, throw them out." He called Baltimore, a largely black city, disgusting, rat and rodent infested. He invokes the word vermin, a classic fascist term. The rhetoric of fascist demonization rallies and hardens a rabid fascist base, fueling and legitimizing a killing program. Concentration camps with tens of thousands of people are on the border today. Children continue to be separated from their parents, and immigrant child separation is a crucial object lesson for why only the sustained mass struggle aimed at removal of the whole regime can stop this. Millions of people were outraged when the child separation first came to light. People protested, and civil liberties lawyers filed suit in court. But the protests died down. And the case was, at first, won in the courts. But this regime ignored the courts, creating new facts on the grounds, and the longer their regime goes on, the more they will be able to pack the courts with fascists, and if they don't like the results, they will ignore them. The travel ban on Muslims was righteously protested, and at first, it was blocked by the courts. The protests waned, and yet the Trump-Pence regime kept going back to the courts till they got the result they wanted. On the third try, they got a very slightly modified ban approved, and that is now the law, and now they're setting about to limit asylum and refugee status dramatically. This lesson is this: fascism comes by degrees, not all at once. But it does advance, and that is happening here. And it can come to pass where the avenues of redress, or removing it, are no more. The Führer's words become fact and law, even as they should be neither. The Trump-Pence fascist regime has made some of their most dangerous and potentially enduring gains in stacking the courts with fascist judges. And a core part of this fascist regime is the alliance with an extensive Christian fascist movement that is, with Mike Pence locked to his side, a leader who will break all their, in recognizing in Trump, a leader who will break all their rules to get their program written into law. The right of women to be full human beings, to control their own destinies, is on the verge of being wiped out as the right to abortion hangs by a thread. So we should not say, and no one should say, that fascism can't happen here. Bob Avakian has said, there is a direct line from the Confederacy to the fascists of today, and a direct connection between their white supremacy, their open disgust and hatred for LGBTQ people as well as women, their willful rejection of science and the scientific method, their raw American first jingoism and trumpeting of the superiority of Western civilization, and their bellicose wielding of military power, including their expressed willingness and blatant threats to use nuclear weapons to destroy countries. The Refuse Fascism call to action cuts to the heart of the matter. Quote, fascism rules by organized repression and terror by the government. Civil liberties are stripped away, law rewritten, dissent criminalized, the courts packed with fascists, and the separation of the powers and of church and state ultimately eviscerated. As part of radically remaking society, the Trump-Pence regime must sharply attack those in positions of power who oppose them. Fascism also mobilizes vicious mobs of vicious thugs, as we've seen with Nazis marching and murdering in Charlottesville, Virginia, and in these mass murders that have taken place. So look, I could take the whole afternoon to illustrate this, but I want to add just one more example for now. Look at Trump's insistence that Hurricane Dorian was going to hit Alabama with his magic marker scrawl on the weather map to illustrate his point, which then the Birmingham Weather Bureau corrected. While the Democrats and liberal pundits trivialized this by joking about it for days, distracting the people with Trump's buffoonery, Trump doubled down. He defended his assertion, and he ordered the governing agency to reprimand the Birmingham Weather Bureau, threatening reprisals. This matters. Why? Well, for one, lives are at stake. Preparation, evacuation, and rescue depend on accurate, objective scientific data. And two, and critical for understanding fascism, the denial of truth and objective evidence are always essential to fascism's advance. Going after the truth, proffering lies, and shredding what is supposed to be a basic civil liberty and governing norm where there is a media free from the direct order and control of the state, Trump consistently attacks the press, branding them as an enemy of the people and even traitors. The relentless attack on what is true, on objective reality, on science, is a key and dangerous component of fascism. This forges a base of people who will believe and follow the truth of the fascist leader, whatever he says, without question. And as truth is eroded and everything becomes seen as just an opinion, and what you believe is determined by who is saying it and what you already want to believe, once the notion of objective truth is erased from society and even outlawed, for after all, what is the logical conclusion of what happens to people who are branded as enemies of the state and traitors? Then people cannot be free to change the world. For to change the world, to overcome all the divisions and forms of oppression that are the world today, requires knowing the world as it actually is. And here it must be said that identity politics and its standpoint epistemology, the notion that truth is determined by who is saying it, by their direct lived experience as a member of a social group, and that truth varies from person to person, does it need to be said that this parallels and thus leaves the door wide open to the Trumpian epistemology? Look, we say this is fascism not as an insult or to be better than everyone else opposed to the regime, but because that is what an objective evaluation shows. Too many, even some who write books warning of fascism, prefer to say it's authoritarian, it's proto-fascist, it's neo-fascist. Anything but to squarely confront that the Trump-Pence regime is fascist. Yes, it has not as yet consolidated a full-out fascist form of rule. If it had already done so, it would be immeasurably more difficult to do what we are planning for. But here's the important point. History shows that it can become too late to stop it without tremendous cost. And yes, it is an American fascism reasserting and recreating the founding myth of this country as a shining city on a hill, a mythology that's wrapped in the flag and the Bible taken literally, white supremacy with the male at the head of the traditional family, with the nation blessed with a divine right to rule over everything. Robert Paxton writes in his book, The Anatomy of Fascism, quote, "The language and symbols of an authentic American fascism would have to be as familiar and reassuring to loyal Americans as the language and symbols of the original fascism were familiar and reassuring to Italians and Germans." Here, too, is why the Democrats and their mouthpieces in the mainstream media have no answers but only mumbles. CNN or NBC prattle on and on about how he can't do what Trump does. That's not normal. That's not presidential. That's not how it's done. When that is precisely the point. Trump and Pence are breaking the norms to bring about a different form of rule to this country, which they and the forces behind them see as the only way to save their vision of America and its capitalist imperialist foundation. And then the Democratic Party works to confine the resistance to the very norms that the fascists, by definition and purpose, seek to tear up. So I will conclude this discussion of fascism with this, which is also from Bob Avakian, who has been identifying, as I said, and analyzing and putting forward how to deal with the development of fascism in the United States over the past several decades. In a speech in October 2017, which is that film I spoke of, the truth, another terrible truth that must be faced, is that in the context of profound and acute contradictions that are asserting or reasserting themselves, that are tearing at the very fabric and deepening cracks in the foundation of this country, at the same time as the American empire is facing serious challenges internationally, fascism is one possible resolution of this. on the terms of this system and its ruling class, even as this is a horror for humanity. And in what is one of the most important insights of the Refuse Fascism call to action is this: we must confront the reality that the world as we have known it is being torn asunder. And this requires getting out of our comfort zones and not allowing our differences to stand in the way of rising together in an unprecedented and unrelenting struggle to confront the danger of a Trump-Pence fascist America. I just want to read the first sentence there. We must confront the reality that the world as we have known it is being torn asunder. That's something that should stay with all of us and cause reflection. But now, with impeachment underway, with the sharpened contention between the ruling parties taking place, and before the 2020 primaries and election go into full authority, now is when the struggle we are calling for is most favorable. It's not easy, but it is possible because many can now grasp how necessary it is. It will not fall into anyone's lap. It will involve a tremendous struggle among the people who desire this regime to be gone over why and how it needs to be done. And I'm going to come to a conclusion of this talk by discussing some of what we have already and will continue to run into. An activist wrote me and declined to participate in the movement for now because, he wrote, we have to respect the struggles that people are already involved in, as if Refuse Fascism does not respect those struggles, which we do. And that he said, and that we should not say that this program of removing the Trump-Pence regime is the only thing that can stop this regime. Well, our sincere question is, well, what else will? What's your program? To which there's no answer. Many fighters for social justice will say, and quite honestly, that they are overwhelmed with what's already on their plate. We really get that. Yet we ask, what will come of every struggle for social justice when fascism is consolidated, when dissent is practically outlawed? We have pointed out before that fascism can absorb separate acts of resistance against the different fronts of their attacks. They will pull back and throw the opposition off balance, moving their agenda forward now here and now there. This is very important. Fascism can absorb separate acts of resistance against different fronts of their attacks. That's the point of the examples of the airports and the Muslim ban, as well as of child separation. As we go out to struggle with people as to why we need to do this, it should also be an invitation to one and to all to contribute their thinking and their questions and their criticisms, their creativity and their energy. And that invitation does not and will not stop when we launch this. Then it really just begins. It needs to be replicated thousands of times over by people we haven't even met yet. To drive out the regime, it cannot be protest as usual. And many of you know the drill. Assemble, speeches, march, more speeches, go home. No. What we are calling for is what you see now in Hong Kong. It is portrayed in the movie The Square about Egypt. It is the students and youth who took to the streets last Friday and will be in the streets next week. People have raised to us as a matter of morality that if I think this plan might not work, I am not responsible to take it. Really? Never, ever has serious social change come with a guarantee. And if one is offered, it is not a real solution. What is irresponsible is not to try. History will not judge us harshly if we try with all we've got to stop fascism and save the planet and humanity, and we don't succeed. But we do today, and we should, judge those who did not stand up in fascist Germany and in other countries when they could have, and chose instead not to resist. We will not escape that judgment should we fail to act. Once again, that poem by Pastor Martin Niemöller captures the horrors that happen when you are just looking out for and saving yourself because you are not directly affected. And in the same vein, people have raised Refuse Fascism, tried this before and didn't succeed. So what will be different this time? For one, people have now experienced almost 3 years of this. And while many have accommodated to the regime, they have also seen and experienced what it has wrought and what it can bring. The murder of Heather Heyer by fascists in Charlottesville in the summer of 2017 has now been followed by several horrific mass murders of Jews and Latino immigrants. 2, people have been through the blue wave, the Mueller investigation, told to wait, had their hopes raised and dashed over and over and over again. And 3, Refuse Fascism has learned a few things. It's been raised also, if we do this, then maybe Trump will declare martial law, and we shouldn't provoke the beast. Let's see if we can ride it out. The writer George Prochnik, in his biography of Stefan Zweig, who was one of the most famous authors in Europe in the 1930s, he lived in Vienna, Prochnik wrote, quote, "The excruciating power of Zweig's memoir lies in the pain of looking back and seeing that there was a small window in which it was possible to act, and then discovering how suddenly and irrevocably that window can be slammed shut." But what about fear? It's been said that the greater fear should be that people will not act to stop this horror. And I've spoken already about the allure, the illusion, and the delusion of painless progress, of relying on the elections to stop what they will not. But people will raise to you concern about their job, their family, and repulsively about not tarnishing their brand. Well, first off, fuck their brand. But yes, this regime is serious. They have said repeatedly that they see in Trump their last and their best chance to bring about a fascist agenda that they have worked on for decades. They have, as Trump has said, quote, "many tough people on their side," end quote. They have been open about wanting a new civil war rather than give up. The matter is, and the questions are, do you want to live in their white supremacist, misogynist, Christian, fascist world?
No.
Do you want to inflict that on the billions of people who the U.S. demonizes and dominates?
No.
Do you want to live in a gated world where huge sections of humanity are locked out and left to drown or starve or live indefinitely in camps?
No.
Then, the question of the hour is, are we going to act now when there is a chance to do something about it? The way to break fear is to act together for what's right. That's what we are setting out to do. There is a tremendous liberating potential and a positive in what we envision. Think about what it would mean for people in this country to act in their millions to say, in the name of humanity, we refuse to live in a fascist America. Think about what that would mean to the people of the world. And when people act together and begin to throw off the chains of all the oppressive relations and thinking that keeps us caged in petty competitive bullshit of this society, and to be working with people like you and many who are not like you, all striving together to drive out a horrific fascist regime as we defy convention and endure good and bad weather, creating a situation where not only can the nightmare of the Trump-Pence regime be over, but we create a movement where dreams can soar, another world is possible, creativity is unleashed, and the impossible becomes possible. Thank you.